At 4:27 in the afternoon on Tuesday, July 28th, the ground under Kumamoto Prefecture let go, along a fault most people outside Japan had never heard of, and by the time the shaking stopped, the Japan Meteorological Agency was calling it a preliminary magnitude 7.1. The U.S. Geological Survey later revised its own number down to 6.8, which we'll get into, because that gap between two respected agencies is one of the most misunderstood parts of any big quake story. As of Thursday, the Kumamoto prefectural government had confirmed at least 34 deaths, with dozens more injured and rescue crews still working the wreckage of a shopping mall and a paper mill. That number is almost certainly going to move before this video is even finished uploading, and I want to be upfront about that from the first sentence, not bury it in a disclaimer at the end. Here's exactly what we know happened over the last 48+ hours, why officials keep comparing this to the deadly 2016 Kumamoto sequence, why this has nothing to do with the Nankai Trough megaquake some corners of the internet are already trying to link it to, and why the historical comparison matters more for what happens next than for what already happened. If you're in Kyushu right now, or you've got family there, drop your location and what you're actually feeling or seeing in the comments. Aftershock reports from real people on the ground are honestly more useful to me putting these updates together than most of the official bulletins, because they tell me where the shaking is spreading before the seismic networks finish processing it. The earthquake struck at 16:27:15 Japan Standard Time on July 28th, 7:27:15 UTC, with an epicenter roughly 5.2 kilometers east of the city of Uto in Kumamoto Prefecture, on the southern main island of Kyushu, about 900 kilometers southwest of Tokyo. The Japan Meteorological Agency's early instrumental reading put the magnitude at 7.1, with a depth of about 10 kilometers, and JMA assigned the maximum shaking intensity on its own seismic intensity scale, Shindo 7, to parts of the epicentral area. That's the top of a scale JMA has only assigned a handful of times in the agency's history. JMA has officially designated this the 2026 Kumamoto earthquake, or, in Japan's imperial-era dating, the Reiwa 8 Kumamoto earthquake. The U.S. Geological Survey, using a different global moment tensor method, put the same event at moment magnitude 6.8 at a similar depth, and its focal mechanism solution described the rupture as consistent with either a northwest-trending left lateral fault or a northeast-trending right lateral fault. Seismology speak for, we know which way the crust slid, we're still narrowing down exactly which mapped fault plane did the sliding. Both readings are correct for what they measure. I'll walk through why they differ later in this video because it's one of the most common sources of the government is hiding the real number conspiracy talk after any major quake, and it isn't that at all. JMA also recorded the highest possible reading on its long-period ground motion scale, level 4, in the Kumamoto region. That's a separate measurement from Shindo that tracks the kind of slow, rolling shaking that's especially dangerous for tall buildings, and more than 100 aftershocks were logged in the immediate aftermath. Within minutes, JMA issued a tsunami advisory for the Ariake and Yatsushiro seas, covering the coastlines of Kumamoto, Nagasaki, Fukuoka, and Saga prefectures, with a forecast wave height of up to 1 meter. Japanese Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi urged coastal residents to stay away from the shoreline while that advisory was active. It was lifted by JMA within about 2 hours, once tide gauge data confirmed the wave action stayed minor. Kumamoto prefectural authorities issued shelter instructions to roughly 300,000 residents in the hours after the main shock, and evacuation centers filled up fast across the hardest-hit municipalities, including Uki, Uto, Hikawa, and Mifune. The worst single loss of life happened at the Aeon Mall shopping center in the town of Kashima, which was packed with shoppers on a Tuesday afternoon. According to the mall operator, around 3,000 customers were evacuated to the parking lot in the immediate aftermath of the shaking, and then an explosion tore through another part of the building, an incident local media and NHK reported was linked to the quake damage, and the mall's second floor came down, trapping people who hadn't gotten out yet. Rescue crews pulled 11 people from that wreckage. As of Thursday morning, Kumamoto authorities had confirmed 6 deaths at the mall site, a number the Japan Times later updated to 7 confirmed mall-related deaths as recovery work continued into Thursday evening. Separately, at a Nippon Paper Industries mill in the city of Yatsushiro, a factory chimney collapsed. 10 workers were pulled out alive, but 8 died at that single site, with 1 more person still unaccounted for, according to the Kumamoto Prefectural Disaster Response Team. Elsewhere, stone sections of the outer wall at Kumamoto Castle came down, the same castle that took years of restoration work after the 2016 quakes cracked its keep, and a train derailed and toppled onto its side at Yatsushiro Station, though Kyoto News reported no fatalities tied to that derailment. Kumamoto Airport briefly suspended runway operations and canceled all domestic flights while ground crews checked for structural damage, resuming service once inspections cleared the runway. International flights were largely unaffected. Japan's defense ministry dispatched aircraft to assess damage from the air within hours of the main shock, and the Fire and Disaster Management Agency coordinated search and rescue teams pulled in from multiple prefectures into the disaster zone. By Thursday, Chief Cabinet Secretary Kihara told reporters the confirmed death toll stood at 28, with additional cases still under investigation to determine whether they were quake-related, a distinction Japanese disaster agencies draw carefully between direct deaths and deaths that happen afterward from things like stress, heat, or interrupted medical care. By Thursday evening, the Kumamoto Prefectural government's own tally had risen to at least 34, a mix of confirmed and still being verified cases, with the BBC and multiple outlets reporting evacuees now also contending with sweltering heat inside shelters. That gap between confirmed and under investigation numbers is exactly the kind of thing that gets flattened into a single scary headline online, so I want to be precise. As of Thursday, the hard confirmed figure and the working total both existed simultaneously in official Japanese reporting, and either number could still climb through the weekend. Physicians dispatched from outside the region, including Dr. Yutaka Kobayashi from central Japan's Aichi Prefecture, were touring evacuation centers by Thursday, specifically to check on evacuees' physical condition, which tells you where the medical priority has already started shifting, from acute trauma care toward shelter conditions monitoring. It's also worth mentioning what worked. Japan's nationwide earthquake early warning system, the network of seismometers that detects a quake's fast-moving initial P wave and pushes out a phone and broadcast alert before the slower, more damaging S wave arrives, triggered across Kyushu ahead of the strongest shaking in Kumamoto and neighboring prefectures, giving residents anywhere from a few seconds to, in areas further from the epicenter, closer to 10 or 15 seconds of warning. That's not a long window, but it's enough time to drop under a table, step away from a window, or for a train operator to trigger emergency braking, which is part of why Kyoto News reported the Yatsushiro Station derailment produced no fatalities despite a train actually coming off the rails. It's a detail that tends to get skipped over in disaster coverage because the warning system worked as designed isn't as dramatic a headline as the collapse footage, but it's a genuinely important part of why Japan's per capita earthquake death toll, event for event, tends to run lower than comparably sized quakes in countries without that infrastructure. Now, let's actually get into why the ground moved the way it did, because this is where a lot of the scarier framing floating around right now falls apart once you understand the mechanism. JMA's initial fault plane analysis describes this as a strike-slip earthquake. That means two blocks of crust on either side of a fault didn't crash toward or away from each other, they slid sideways past one another, roughly horizontally, like two rough wooden planks grinding past each other edge to edge, rather than one plank slamming flat on top of the other. That second kind of motion, one slab of crust thrusting up and over another, is what you typically need to displace a huge volume of ocean water and generate a large tsunami, which is a big part of why the advisory here topped out at 1 meter and cleared in 2 hours, instead of escalating the way a subduction zone megathrust event would. The region sits at the intersection of the Futagawa and Hinagu fault zones, the same two fault systems responsible for the devastating April 2016 Kumamoto earthquakes, and near the southern end of the median tectonic line, Japan's longest active fault system, which runs most of the length of the country. According to Professor Aitaro Kato of the University of Tokyo's Earthquake Research Institute, this week's rupture occurred just south of the main 2016 source area, and he's flagged the real risk now as a possible chain reaction propagating further south along the fault system, which is exactly the kind of stress transfer pattern seismologists watch closely after any strike-slip main shock. Fellow University of Tokyo Earthquake Research Institute scientist Shinichi Sakai has said the current earthquake may have been caused by slip on the southern portion of the Hinagu fault specifically, the same fault where, in 2016, only the northern section ruptured, transferring stress onto the southern section that appears to have finally let go this week. Sakai has separately pointed out that the southern tip of the Hinagu fault zone runs out under the sea, which is why officials aren't ruling out tsunami risk entirely if aftershock activity migrates in that direction, even though this particular event didn't produce one of consequence. Picture the fault zone here like a long zipper buried in the crust, made up of separate interlocking segments rather than one continuous seam. In 2016, the northern segment near the Hinagu fault let go first as a foreshock. Then 2 days later, a neighboring segment on the Futagawa fault tore in the far larger main shock. The rupture didn't stay contained to where it started. It jumped to an adjacent, already stressed section of zipper. That's the exact pattern JMA is watching for again now. Not a repeat of the same earthquake, but the same kind of segment-to-segment handoff, just starting from a different stretch of the zipper this time, roughly 10 years and one prefecture length of accumulated stress later. The clearest historical yardstick for this event is the 2016 Kumamoto earthquake sequence itself, and it's worth being precise about what actually happened then, rather than the vague, "there was a big quake here before" version that tends to circulate. On April 14, 2016, a magnitude 6.5 quake struck on the northern Hinagu fault zone at 21:26 local time, with a focal mechanism showing strike-slip faulting along a north-south tension axis, followed by a magnitude 6.4 aftershock just hours later on April 15th, with a slightly different NNW to SSE tension axis. JMA treated those as a serious event in their own right and warned publicly about the risk of further damaging aftershocks. But at 1:25 in the morning on April 16th, a magnitude 7.3 earthquake ruptured the neighboring Futagawa fault zone in what turned out to be the actual main shock, its own strike-slip mechanism oriented along a northwest-southeast tension axis, meaning the aftershock everyone was bracing for turned out to be smaller than the earthquake that came after it. Researchers studying that sequence afterward specifically flagged that Japan's official earthquake research committee had judged the April 14th and 15th events as standalone earthquakes rather than as foreshocks to something larger, and that JMA's own protocol at the time didn't allow it to publicly flag an elevated probability of a magnitude 7+ event before the Futagawa rupture happened, which is precisely why the agency's public messaging this week leans so heavily on blunt, repeated aftershock warnings rather than reassurance. That sequence's final numbers, according to Kumamoto Prefecture's own confirmed accounting, came to 3,009 total casualties, 273 dead, and 2,736 injured. Once disaster-related deaths from the physical toll of evacuation were folded in over the following months. Close to 198,000 homes across the prefecture were damaged in some form, 8,642 completely destroyed, 34,389 half destroyed, and 155,227 partially damaged. Peak evacuee numbers in Kumamoto Prefecture alone hit roughly 184,000 people, with another 12,400 in neighboring Oita Prefecture, and more than 4,000 aftershocks of intensity 1 or greater were recorded within 6 months of the first tremor, a pace that, at the time, exceeded even the aftershock activity following the 2004 mid-Niigata Prefecture earthquake. The Cabinet Office put the capital stock damage to Kumamoto Prefecture at 3.8 trillion yen, roughly 11% of the prefecture's entire 34 trillion yen capital base, with an additional 81 to 113 billion yen in lost economic activity in the single month after the quake, and hotel and lodging cancellations across the prefecture topped 330,000 room nights. That's the exact history behind why a JMA official stood up at a press conference this week and, referencing strong quakes in this area in the past, which subsequently caused a series of strong temblors, urged residents to stay on alert for Shindo 7-level shaking for roughly a week, with the highest risk concentrated in the next 2 to 3 days. That's not generic caution, that's an agency that watched its own foreshock warning in 2016 get overtaken by a bigger main shock 2 days later, and is not going to make the same conservative-sounding call twice without naming the specific historical reason for it. On the numbers side, seismologists studying the current sequence have already mapped the early aftershocks spreading along roughly a 50-kilometer stretch running from the coastline south of Yatsushiro up toward Kumamoto City, and that clustering pattern is a meaningful clue, because aftershocks concentrate in the zone where the fault actually slipped, giving researchers an early read on the rupture's footprint before formal fault models are finished. Independent seismic analysis published within days of the main shock noted that this week's epicenter sits inside a region that 2016's Coulomb stress modeling, essentially a map of which surrounding fault sections got pushed closer to failure by the earlier rupture, had already flagged as a likely zone for future triggered earthquakes. In plain terms, this earthquake happening roughly where it did isn't a coincidence disconnected from 2016. It's arguably the kind of event that stress transfer models predicted could eventually happen in that exact stretch of crust. A magnitude 4.1 aftershock was recorded just after midnight local time on Wednesday near Uto, and JMA's decay-based forecasting, the standard statistical expectation, often described by seismologists using something called Omori's law, that aftershock frequency drops off roughly in proportion to elapsed time since the main shock, while remaining capable of the occasional sharp spike, is exactly why officials aren't declaring this over after 48 hours, even though the immediate hourly aftershock rate has already begun tapering from its first-day peak. Let's clear up a few things circulating online right now, because I've seen all of these in the comments across other channels covering this. First, this is not the same earthquake as 2016 happening again. It's a separate rupture on a fault segment south of the 2016 source zone, and while researchers are actively investigating whether it was promoted by stress left over from 2016, calling it a repeat misunderstands both events. Second, the tsunami advisory topping out at 1 meter and clearing in 2 hours was not officials downplaying danger. A strike-slip fault, by its sideways motion, is mechanically a poor generator of large tsunami waves compared to a thrust event, so the modest advisory matched the physics, not political pressure. Third, the USGS magnitude of 6.8 versus JMA's 7.1 is not one agency covering up the real number. JMA's MJ scale is calibrated specifically for Japanese seismic networks and tends to run higher for shallow domestic events, while USGS uses a global moment magnitude method built for worldwide consistency. Both are legitimate readings of the same physical event through different mathematical lenses, and Japanese emergency response is built around the JMA figure precisely because it's tuned for local shaking intensity, not the global picture. And fourth, the one I'd actually push back on hardest, this is not a sign that the Nankai Trough megaquake is imminent, and if you've seen a thumbnail this week implying that, it's mechanism illiterate at best. The Nankai Trough is a roughly 700 to 800 kilometer subduction zone running from Shizuoka down past Kyushu, where the Philippine sea plate is slowly diving underneath the Japanese mainland, a completely different fault system, hundreds of kilometers away from the shallow crustal strike-slip fault that ruptured in Kumamoto this week, and a completely different mechanism, capable of a magnitude 8 to 9 event because it can rupture hundreds of kilometers of locked plate boundary at once, rather than a 40-kilometer stretch of crustal fault. Japan's government does maintain a standing estimate that there's roughly a 70 to 80% chance of a Nankai Trough megaquake within the next 30 years, with worst-case government modeling projecting up to around 298,000 deaths and tsunami run-up as high as 34 meters in the most exposed coastal areas. Those are real, serious numbers from serious government risk planning, but a shallow strike-slip quake on the Hinagu fault doesn't mechanically load stress onto that subduction interface in any way that changes this week's earthquake into evidence the Nankai Trough is now due. Sharing that kind of thumbnail without the mechanism behind it just trains people to panic at the wrong signal. The damage has rippled well past the immediate disaster zone. More than 36,000 homes across the region were left without electricity in the initial outage, and by Wednesday, 43 medical institutions across Kumamoto Prefecture were dealing with some combination of power, water, or gas disruption, according to the U.S. Embassy in Japan's Situation Alert, including a hospital in Uki City that reportedly couldn't operate at all after losing power. All post offices in Kumamoto Prefecture closed on July 29th. Cell networks around Yatsushiro City reported connectivity problems, with only SoftBank's network reporting no disruption in that area. On the industrial side, Toyota announced it would halt operations at 3 plants in southern Japan through Friday, while it assessed supplier and logistics impacts. A reminder that Kyushu isn't just a disaster zone right now, it's also a manufacturing hub feeding parts into wider regional and global supply chains. Kyushu's semiconductor and auto parts corridor has been rebuilt as a genuinely significant node in Japan's industrial base since 2016. So a multi-day plant halt here echoes further down global supply chains than it would have a decade ago. If the 2016 sequence is any guide for how this plays out economically, Kumamoto Prefecture absorbed capital stock damage equal to roughly a tenth of its entire prefectural asset base back then, and reconstruction spending rippled through the regional economy for years afterward, according to later input-output analysis of the recovery. So whatever damage tally comes out of this week's quake, the honest expectation is a multi-year regional economic story, not a headline that resolves once the rubble is cleared. Layered on top of all of it, daytime temperatures in the region were forecast to hit around 34 degrees Celsius, 93 Fahrenheit this week, which is exactly the kind of heat that turns a crowded, powerless evacuation shelter into a genuine medical risk for elderly evacuees, something Japanese disaster medicine teams, including physicians dispatched from as far away as Aichi Prefecture, are actively triaging for right now. There's also a landslide risk that's emerged as a distinct secondary hazard. A slope failure was confirmed on Mount Mayuyama in Shimabara, Nagasaki Prefecture, and disaster response helicopters were being sent out to assess it, worth remembering since Mount Mayuyama's slopes have a documented history of catastrophic collapse going back to Japan's deadliest volcanic disaster in 1792, so officials treat any new slope movement there with real caution rather than routine monitoring. Here's specifically what to watch in the coming days. First, the JMA's own 2 to 3 day high alert window for Shindo 7-level aftershocks runs out around this weekend, and whether that window closes quietly or gets extended will tell you a lot about how researchers are reading the current stress state of the fault. Second, keep an eye on activity specifically migrating south along the Hinagu fault zone toward the coast. That's the scenario Professor Kato and Dr. Sakai have both flagged as the one that could reintroduce meaningful tsunami risk, unlike this week's event. Third, watch the confirmed versus under investigation death toll gap. Japanese authorities update that distinction methodically rather than quickly, so a jump in the confirmed number later this week doesn't necessarily mean a new tragedy, it may just mean casework catching up. Fourth, watch the Mount Mayuyama slope assessment out of Nagasaki Prefecture. That's a genuinely separate hazard from the Kumamoto rupture zone, and it's the kind of secondary story that can get lost while all the attention is on the mall and the mill sites. And fifth, watch what Toyota and other regional manufacturers say heading into next week about whether Friday's planned restart actually holds, since that's a decent real-time proxy for how confident the region's infrastructure, power, roads, port access actually is behind the scenes, regardless of what the official statements say. If you're anywhere in Kyushu or you've got a coastal address on the Ariake or Yatsushiro Sea, even outside the current advisory zone, the standard, boring, effective guidance still applies. Know your nearest designated evacuation shelter before you need it. Keep shoes and a flashlight within reach of wherever you sleep for the next week, given the elevated aftershock window. And if you're in a building that took any visible damage, treat re-entry as something to clear with an inspector, rather than your own judgment. Because Shindo 5 and 6 aftershocks can bring down a structure that held through the main shock, but was quietly weakened. Make sure earthquake early warning alerts are actually enabled on your phone rather than assumed to be on by default, and treat every alert during this elevated window as real, rather than getting numb to it after the first couple of false feeling ones. A few seconds of warning only helps if you actually move when it buzzes. If you're in one of the shelters right now, the heat is arguably as immediate a risk as the aftershocks. Prioritize hydration and shade over pride about not wanting to bother the volunteers, especially if you're elderly or caring for someone who is, because heat-related deaths in shelter conditions are exactly the category of disaster-related death that padded the 2016 toll well past its initial count. And if you know someone in the region, or you know someone who tends to panic and share unverified numbers or Nankai Trough doomsaying the moment a scary headline crosses their feed, send them this video, rather than whatever's circulating with an inflated death toll or a fake megaquake warning. Accurate information genuinely reduces panic better than reassurance alone does. And if you want the death toll, aftershock activity, and JMA's alert window updated the moment there's real movement, rather than waiting for a weekly recap, that's what subscribing here actually gets you. I'll have the next update as soon as there's something worth reporting, not before. This is very much still an unfolding story. Rescue crews are still working against the clock at both the Aeon Mall site and the Nippon Paper Industries mill. The missing persons count from both sites hasn't been finalized. The Mount Mayuyama slope assessment is still pending, and the region is still inside JMA's own highest alert aftershock window. I'll keep tracking it as the numbers firm up.